The 2008 Formula 1 season had pretty much everything you could ever want from, well, an F1 season. You had a title showdown, you had drama, you had iffy stewards' decisions, although you don't actually want the iffy stewards' decisions, you want good stewards' decisions. You know, good stewards' decisions. But because social media didn't operate in the same way that it does today, any fallout from those iffy stewards' decisions and other bits and pieces was nicely contained. And looking back on it all now, it's making me feel, well, a little bit old. It was Hamilton's second season in Formula 1. Now he's getting on for his, 17th season, 18th season? Basically, his career will be able to buy a drink in a pub in the next 12 months or so, and he's still going. At the same time, nobody in 2008 expected that he'd have amassed the records that he currently has. Who, in 2008, would have thought that he'd have the same amount of titles as Schumacher and over 100 Grand Prix wins and pole positions? But even then, both Hamilton and Massa through the course of that season both seemed to do their best to try and lose the championship. Massa with his Silverstone spinning, Hamilton with his brain left at home moment in the pits at Montreal, then Massa getting a penalty at Fuji when he didn't need to, because Hamilton had already got one for forcing Raikkonen off the road at turn 1. There are others, but these are the ones that immediately spring to mind. But where it all ended was that gripping race in Brazil. Massa was leading the Grand Prix and Hamilton was down in 6th with just a couple of laps left to run. It seemed that at the absolute moment he didn't need to, Hamilton had bottled it, and Massa was going to take the victory and the championship. But at the very last possible second, the role reversed. Suddenly, Hamilton was in the position he needed to be in to win the championship, and 100,000 local hearts sank in the grandstands. And the ire of a lot of people online and at the racetrack was immediately directed at one person, Toyota's Timo Glock. Now, I'm not really going to be focusing so much on the actual race. This is mostly the last sort of 2-3 laps or so, and then the aftermath to try and figure out one thing. Where did this whole Glock moved over conspiracy start from? Something I like to call Formula 1's dumbest conspiracy. And I did a video on that conspiracy, about 3.5 years, 4 years ago, so some of you might have watched this already, and that's fine. From time to time, I redo some of those older videos to make sure that information is corrected, quality is improved, and bits and pieces like that. And by the time you watch this, I'm going to be away doing other bits and pieces, so I thought I'd do this as something for you to watch that will hopefully be interesting. Because since I did that video back in 2020 or whenever it was, other bits and pieces have since come out. More interviews have been conducted, more information is available, and just do some other bits and pieces of quality control. But this isn't going to be a shot-for-shot, word-for-word remake. Those are boring. So with a few laps left to run in the 2008 Brazilian Grand Prix, what were the championship permutations? How could Massa win the championship, and how could Hamilton lose the championship? Because that's basically what was about to happen. Basically, if Massa won the race, Hamilton had to be no lower than 5th. If Hamilton was 6th and Massa won the race, they'd be equal on points, but Massa would have won the championship through having won one more race over the course of the season. If Massa ended up 2nd, then Hamilton couldn't be lower than 8th. If Hamilton retired, then Massa could finish 3rd and still be champion. Hamilton went into the race 7 points ahead of Massa, which sounds close today, but back then you only got 10 points for a win, so Massa had less wiggle room than he would have done, well, today. For a realistic shot at taking the championship, he had to win the race. And the biased British media was saying that Hamilton was more likely to bottle the championship than he was to actually win the championship, and Ferrari would end up taking the Drivers' and the Constructors' Championships in one fell swoop. Late in the race, Timo Glock had managed to use the pit stop cycle to jump from 7th to 4th, this being when the final rain shower came and it was going to be touch and go as to whether the race could finish before the rain got worse. This was around lap 66 or 67, because Hamilton and Vettel had pitted for intermediates on lap 66, and Massa had come in a lap later. On lap 69, nice, Hamilton went wide after being unlapped by Kubica, and Vettel took the opportunity. McLaren were in shambles, and Ferrari knew that Hamilton was outside the position that he needed to be able to win. Essentially, Hamilton needed it to rain, otherwise Glock in the Toyota, who hadn't stopped, would be able to stay ahead. But with 2 laps to go, he got the miracle he needed. It started to rain harder than it already was, and Glock was now in trouble. Toyota's gamble hadn't paid off. Or had it? Hamilton was still looking every which way to get by Vettel, whose Toro Rosso seemed to be better in the wet than Hamilton's McLaren, and part of that was because McLaren had put too much pressure into the intermediates that Hamilton had been put onto. They were closing in on Glock, but everybody was too focused on Vettel and Hamilton battling that nobody realised until it was too late. Hence Martin Brundle exclaiming those now famous words, "Is that Glock? Is that Glock going slowly?" Now, David Croft, who was commentating for BBC 5 Live, didn't realise until Hamilton had crossed the line as to what was going on, and Ferrari hadn't realised either. There's that camera shot of the Massa family celebrating Felipe's championship, only for one of the mechanics to come over and go, "No, Hamilton's in 5th, Hamilton's won the championship," and they all go to have a look, and then the mechanic gives a Glasgow kiss to the wall and ends up breaking a sign. But then the whispers start circulating online. Glock starts going slow on the final lap and just conveniently hands the place to Hamilton. It all seemed a bit sus. Jonathan McAvoy of the Daily Mail reported 2 days after the race on the 4th of November 2008 that there'd been pretty much zero whisper of anything dodgy happening, at least within the paddock. Nobody in the media who was there was even beginning to entertain this silly notion that Glock had purposely moved over for Hamilton in the dying seconds of the Grand Prix to gift him the championship. But before the idea could be filed away along with JFK, Elvis and Amelia Earhart all living on some unnamed Hawaiian island along with Princess Diana, it started appearing on the message boards. From reports that were put out at the time, the general idea is that all this started in Spain. The Spanish Formula 1 fans already disliked Hamilton because of 2007, and in some cases, they'd taken it to some extremes. One of the more prominent examples is some Spanish fans turning up to a pre-season test in Barcelona held in the February of 2008 in full blackface, wearing signs that said Hamilton's family. While Hamilton was initially bothered by it, he later moved on, with Alonso saying, which was quoted by ESPN, "This is not a racist country. This was an isolated thing, and the less it's talked about, the better." But online, some of the comments that were being left included, "Who are Hamilton's friends in the paddock? Rosberg and Glock. Enough said." Even though, after Hamilton had forced Glock off the road in Monza, Glock had said that he was never going to be nice to Lewis ever again. There was also an online game circulating in Spain called Pincha la Rueda de Hamilton. GCSE Spanish has completely failed me on that one, but Pincha la Rueda de Hamilton. There we go, I think I've got it, which basically translates to puncture Hamilton's tyre or puncture Hamilton's wheel. It was essentially like this voodoo doll where you left nasty messages and then those messages were translated into like nails or pins or something so that when Hamilton drove over them, his tyre exploded, which is just completely insane. But it wasn't just in Spain. In Italy, Glock had been on the receiving end of a lot of hate from the Italian media, with journalists pointing fingers at him and saying he'd done the whole thing on purpose and that the whole thing was planned before the race, asking questions like, "How much did Mercedes pay you?" and things like that. But then again, this is the same Italian media that said that Schumacher should have been tried in a Spanish court for what he did at Jerez in 1997. Letters started reaching his parents' house saying that Glock should be shot and should never race in Formula 1 again. I'm sure they were just passionate fans. But Glock wasn't even aware that Hamilton was behind him. In 2008, he told Autosport, "I was racing for Toyota and my place, which is the correct thing to do. I didn't even know that Lewis was directly behind me. The team told me that Sebastian Vettel was catching me and they kept me updated on his position, but I was concentrating so hard on keeping the car on the track. I didn't even know that Lewis had overtaken me until after the race. I was passed by 3 or 4 cars on the final lap, and it was not easy to keep track of what was going on." Glock even mentioned that he wanted to pit in those last couple of laps because he really was struggling, but he wasn't able to because the pit lane was blocked, with people getting the podium ceremonies ready. Basically, everybody was freaking out because they were getting ready to welcome home Brazil's first world champion in 17 years. And Glock took that personally. He didn't, I just wanted to use the meme. But in all seriousness though, this all ended up being a little bit premature. But this hate and this notion that Glock moved over wasn't just limited to Spain and Italy, because even here in Britain, where everybody and their dog is a Lewis Hamilton fan, keck, the comments were pouring into the Have Your Say sections of the BBC Sport website and also the Autosport forums. One comment said, "Glock stopped because they are buddies from GP2. Glock needs to be banned from FIA sanctioned events for life. Unbelievable." And at the same time, the switchboards for BBC 5 Live, which is the BBC's... I actually don't know what you would call 5 Live, because they broadcast sport on there, but they also have like chat and discussion. But the people that call into 5 Live tend to be a little more on this planet compared to the bozos that call into LBC and TalkSport. So yeah, it's basically LBC meets TalkSport, but then you need to know what LBC is, and you can probably figure out what TalkSport is. But anyway, it's those two mashed together, but a tiny bit more highbrow. Sort of. But anyway, the switchboards lit up on 5 Live because people were absolutely convinced that Timo had taken a dive for his mate, Lewis. In 2018, for the 10th anniversary of that particular race, the Formula 1 YouTube channel uploaded the full onboard of Glock's final lap, just to show how difficult he had it when the rain properly came down in that final lap and a half. It's quite clear that he's struggling. He lifts and coasts in a massive way for turn 1. The gear shifts are way less aggressive than they otherwise would have been, and he's short shifting all the way through turn 3 to stop the rear end from kicking out. Now normally in the wet you'd be gentler on the throttle in that corner anyway due to there being less grip and the cars were in their first year without traction control, but even on the straight between turns 3 and 4, he's not anywhere near full throttle. Glock even gets a slight kick of oversteer in turn 3, exiting the corner in 4th and none of his rev lights coming on, showing just how much short shifting he's having to do through the corner. He barely gets up to 6th gear before lifting and coasting into 4, just so he can pull up without sliding straight off towards the outside wall. As he had done coming through turn 3, in turn 4 he has another wobble of oversteer and has to correct, and the car that overtakes him, which I think is Heidfeld, buggers off into the distance like it's an F1 car versus a road car, rather than a F1 car versus another F1 car. In the hairpin section in the middle of the track, the Toyota simply does not want to turn, and Glock is using all the engine braking he can to slow the car down. And as he comes through that kink before the final corner, Kubica overtakes him as he almost loses it for like the 5th time. And then he slides wide through Junsau, I hope I've pronounced that correctly, and that's where Vettel and Hamilton get through. As he gets on the power to come up the hill, he almost loses it again. And if he really had taken a dive for Hamilton, he'd have simply sped up and charged towards the finish line. But he didn't. He was overtaken by one of the Hondas for good measure as he crawls up the hill in 5th gear, doing everything he can to avoid spinning up the rears and crashing. At the end of it all, he'd gone from 7th to 4th and then dropped back down to 6th as Hamilton and Vettel overtook him at that final corner. So by staying out, he'd actually gained a position. What's also interesting to note is that if you look at the lap times from that final lap, you'll see the one thing that immediately rubbishes the conspiracy before you even watch the onboard footage from Glock's car. Massa did a 27.7, Alonso a 26.1, Raikkonen 28.2, Vettel 25.9, Hamilton 26.1, and then Glock a 44.7. His teammate Trulli, who was the only other car on the dry tyres at that time, did a 44.8. Glock slowed down to help Hamilton so much he did near as makes no difference the same time that Trulli did on the final lap. You can't choreograph that. The onboard footage and the live timing that are available online has managed to make people see that actually Glock didn't take the dive that people seem to think that he did, but there are still people out there that think he did. Someone I went to school with posted something on Facebook about how it was all rigged, and then I showed him the footage of Glock on the dry tyres. "Those are wet tyres, you can see the grooves," he said, not remembering that in those days, Formula 1 cars ran on the 4 grooves and didn't go back to slicks until the following year. Glock was happy to see the footage going up, saying, "This calmed down the situation totally as I can just send people that now. I have no idea why it took them so long, but I also have no idea why I never thought to ask them to put the onboard online. But it's helped people understand that there was no tactic behind it and it was just a battle to keep it on the racetrack." But it's not the first time that McLaren have been accused of race fixing in a championship decider. During the 1997 European Grand Prix, Villeneuve was driving slowly to make sure his car made the end, and he scored the right amount of points to overtake Schumacher. Basically, if he scored 6th or higher, he would win the title. And while Villeneuve was driving slowly, Coulthard and Hakkinen were catching up. Patrick Head went over to McLaren and said something to the effect of, "Look, he's not going to fight you, you can just go on by, we've got what we came for, so make sure your boys don't do something silly." But there were also allegations that before the race, Williams had spoken to McLaren about helping JV win the championship by having McLaren hold up Irvine. The charges were dropped. Which reminds me, I probably should do the video on why JV was disqualified from the Japanese Grand Prix and how that set up that championship finale in the first place. It might actually end up going up before you see this because I'm recording this last week, if you follow me. But Brazil 2008 is up there in most memorable championship finales, for better or for worse, depending on which side of the fence you sit on. What's cool about it is that in the last 2 or 3 years, both Massa and Hamilton have both spoken to Glock, and Massa shook Glock's hand and said that none of it was his fault. And Massa, being the absolute champion he was in defeat on the podium and taking the whole thing on the chin, was one of the best pieces of sportsmanship I've ever seen in the time I've been watching F1. Something that some would think has now disappeared given all this lawsuit stuff that's come about in the last year and a bit. But the thing is, there is no conspiracy. Glock and Trulli gambled on the rain coming en masse after the race had finished, and with about 2 minutes to go, it caught them out. Glock actually gained a position by staying out, and at the end of it all, it actually didn't matter whether he stayed out or not, because Hamilton would have finished ahead either way. But Glock does have a sense of humour about it. He loves it every November because it's going to come up, and he can engage with some of the more insane theories that pop up. Glock knows he didn't help Hamilton out. Hamilton knows he didn't help Hamilton out. Massa knows he didn't help Hamilton out, and is more preoccupied with Singapore as he thinks that's the more egregious thing that happened that year. Ferrari knows that Glock didn't help Hamilton, because if they thought they did, you just know they'd have protested, because that was their MO at the time. It's going to be one of those things that will never go away. Despite evidence to the contrary, there are going to be some people that will think that Glock took a dive for Hamilton. But I'd like to know what you think. Did you always think it was silly? Do you still think that Hamilton got helped out by Glock? Or are you one of these people that thought that Glock had taken a dive but now see that you were wrong all along? Yeah, that rhymes. Yeah, leave a comment down in the comment section underneath the video and get a discussion going. So then, a second look at the absolutely ridiculous Timo Glock moved over for Lewis Hamilton conspiracy theory that has waned in recent years, but will always somehow still be there. Like I said, let me know what you think of all of it down in the comment section and get a discussion going. And while scrolling down, if you think I did a good job with this video, give it a like by clicking the thumbs up thing. And if you're not already, get subscribed and get the bell on so you never miss out on anything else that I do around here. Massive thanks as ever go out to the rad lads at Patreon. If you want to help support me at a more personal level, there is a link to Patreon in the description, along with links to Discord, socials, and my affiliate links. So if you buy something from the F1 store or from Mixed Garage, I get a little bit of a kickback, and that helps keep the lights on around here. There's also super thanks if you just want to top up my coffee cup, and there's also memberships if you want to do Patreon without going through Patreon. So until next time, I've been AdmiralLaWind. Have a great day wherever you are, and goodbye.